300 million years ago, there was no Africa, Asia, Americas, or Europe. Just one big supercontinent, Pangea. And today, there is still a force connecting those divided by distance, reversing millions of years of rifting. Making far feel close, bringing there to here. Turkish Airlines.
You are watching In Conversation This Week with Miceal O'Hurley.
My guest today is a veteran Russian diplomat who famously resigned his diplomatic post in Geneva as Russia's expert on arms control and nuclear non-proliferation, and other vital topics as a diplomat. Disparaged by Moscow as a traitor, celebrated by the West as a courageous diplomat. Who is this man, and what can he tell us about the groupthink that permeates the Kremlin around the authoritarian regime of Vladimir Putin? I want to welcome to In Conversation This Week, Mr. Boris Bondarev, a late diplomat of the Russian Federation, now in Geneva. He has a lot to tell us and a lot to offer. Boris, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me.
Your July 2nd piece in The Economist, you wrote, Vladimir Putin's attack on Ukraine on February 24th was a moment of truth for me. It led to my resignation as a senior Russian diplomat just weeks later. That is because it became crystal clear that to stay in the Foreign Service and continue to work for the government unequivocally meant supporting Russian aggression. The war against Ukraine and against the entire West has been the gravest blunder of today's Russia, and I consider it a crime against the country's future. Powerful words. What moved you at this time to resign? Russia has been aggressive for the 22 years of Vladimir Putin's reign. The 1990 Treaty on Conventional Arms Forces in Europe, Russia withdrew. They've pushed the limits on territorial claims in the Arctic and only agreed to a 5-year extension to the new START Treaty. At the same time, Putin has deployed troops in Russia, in Chechnya, Moldova, Georgia, Africa, Syria, and Ukraine. He's weaponized energy. He's sought and threatened the release of nuclear weapons against the West if they continue to support Ukraine. Why leave now? What was the triggering point for you?
First of all, I would like to underline that I don't consider all things that you just listed as the signs of Russian aggression, for instance. First of all, some of those conflicts you listed were, they originated in the late years of the Soviet Union as a sign of its being dismantled somehow. And Vladimir Putin inherited many of them from previous time, from President Yeltsin, for instance, like the conflict in Chechnya, for instance. And you know that the first Chechen war was started in 1994 by President Yeltsin. And the second was in 1999 when Vladimir Putin was appointed prime minister, but the president was still Boris Yeltsin. And we have a lot of questions about this war, but anyway, it was, there is no doubt among the Russians and even for me that we cannot blame only Russian government for that, because the Chechenian leaders in that time, they were not good guys at all. So, and as you also listed some international treaties, I would also say that for instance, if you're referring to the New START treaty, it's not that Russia agreed only to a 5-year extension. It is the United States which agreed only to 5 years, and that after a very long period of requesting such things from Russia, because it was in the Russian interest to prolong this New START treaty, because it is obvious that Russia is far weaker in terms of military expense, for instance, than the United States. And to maintain this enormous nuclear arsenal is a heavy burden for Russian budget. So it was in Moscow interested to have these threshold limits stipulated by the New START as low as possible. And, you know, during the Trump presidency, the United States were very reluctant to discuss any limitations or restrictions in regard to arms control. And Mr. Billingsley, whom you may remember, was the Trump's representative on arms control. He was very categorical that the United States would not extend the New START. And it was only Joe Biden who was very prudent and who just made it possible at the last minute, so to speak. So it's not about only the Russian fault, and I don't want to be an advocate for Vladimir Putin, of course I'm not, but I don't think that to paint him alone with the black color would be correct. For instance, the US also unilaterally withdrew from the Treaty on Anti-Ballistic Defense in 2004, as far as I remember, by George Bush Jr. And so there was some, and Vladimir Putin during his first and more or less second term was quite adequate president, both for Russian interests domestically and internationally. And of course, I think he was bound to confront the West because of his background, his education, his personal traits, and also because of the regime he was building, regime of his personal power, and regime which main goal is to make Vladimir Putin and his friends rich at the expense of all other Russian society. So going back to your question, many of these things which now can be considered as aggressive, they were not considered as such at that time. And for instance, I didn't consider them like placing Russian peacekeeping forces in Moldova in early 90s. Well, I was 12 years old boy, so I didn't think nothing about that, and I didn't think anything about that after, even when I became diplomat, because it was not my area of expertise. And I don't think that it is a bad idea to keep peace between Moldova and this Transnistria region. So, okay, you can say that it is kind of interference into domestic affairs of Moldova, but nevertheless. So, but even Crimea and Donbass things in 2014 did not look as aggression or some kind of a crime from the Russia, because it is very complicated issues, especially Crimean issue for the Russian society. And still, you know, Crimea was very swift operation. It was bloodless, and it was not much surprise that a lot of Crimeans, I don't know how many, but quite a huge share of the population were very keen to be, well, in Russia, more than in Ukraine, for instance. I cannot say about today, of course, it's different, but then it was more or less clear. I understood then that this Crimean and Donbass thing would have, and they did, a lot of hard consequences for Russia in terms of sanctions, in terms of diplomatic isolation, and so on. And I had in my job then to somehow to mitigate these consequences, working with the sanctions, working in the area of export controls, and so on. But this year, this open aggression against Ukraine and its goals to, well, in short, in plain words, to destroy Ukraine as a state and to destroy Ukrainians as a nation. It was something unimaginable for me because I was born in Soviet Union. We have always known that Ukrainians and Belarusians and others are brotherly nations, brotherly peoples. Well, we have a lot of close connections on personal levels, on people's levels. And when I woke up on the February 24th and I read the news and that Russian Air Force bombed Kiev, Chernihiv, Kharkov, and other cities, it was something like, last time it was a German Air Force which bombed Kiev and Kharkov during the beginning of the 1940, the June 22, 1941. So it was this, and now we change places with Nazi. So in the day I understood that it was like this point which you cannot keep telling yourself that you should endure this more. You should behave like nothing has happened. You should. So what can I do? I'm a small person. I can just have my job. I can just trying to get some money to sustain my family and blah 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 blah. It's not mine to decide. People up high there, they see the bigger picture, but I realized that no, I cannot keep telling myself these lies anymore, and that's a good. And also I realized that the reaction to that would not be the same as it was in 2014, which it was very, very easy, I would say, very, very light. No, it would be devastating, and it is, and we see it. So I decided to quit because I didn't want to be associated with this crime.
When I speak to Crimean Tatars or Ukrainians in Crimea, which Russian Federation recognized as sovereign territory of Ukraine, and gave security assurances in the Budapest Memorandum, they don't see the Russian occupation of Crimea as a bloodless act. Scores of Crimean Tatars disappeared from their homes, were found murdered, bound and gagged, beaten, imprisoned, transported to Russia for trial and imprisonment with very little, if any, discernible legal defense that we would recognize as due process of law. Do the Russian people today, in your opinion, still believe that it was a bloodless operation and that there was justification, despite Russia's guarantees that they would defend the sovereign territory of Ukraine?
I think today, even then, it wasn't something that totally occupied the minds of Russian people. Today, I believe that also very, very few who are thinking about Crimea or even Ukraine, because for most people, it's not even the war. For most people, just special military operation, like some special, special units working like they are fighting some terrorists and blah, blah, blah. Some people, they don't even understand the scale of this war. And they don't even know about the bombings of the cities, of mass murders of the civilians and so on. They don't know, and they don't want to know, because this would spoil their more or less their daily lives, which is also full of a lot of problems, difficulties, because to live in Russia today takes a lot of personal resources to cope with all this not friendly environment. Because today Russian society is very split. It is atomized, and every man is left to his own devices, and he must find ways to survive. And if you are also occupied with what is going on in Ukraine or in Crimea, you will just waste your limited psychological strength on this. So I think many people just don't think about it at all. And I think if they are shown the truth, maybe they will start thinking somehow. I'm not sure.
I want to parse that because it's a very interesting observation, Boris. When the war started, maybe 30 to 40% of the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, had not disfavorable leanings towards Russia. Today, I think you'd find less than 10% of the Rada could even suffer Russia. The number of people in Ukraine who spoke Russian on a daily basis has declined sharply. Jokingly, but with great truth, very few people have done more to consolidate the idea of a Ukrainian nationality, culture, individuality than Vladimir Putin's violence against Ukraine. So we know that it's not achieved his overarching goals, either militarily, culturally, or politically. And now with the advances on the battlefield by the Ministry of Defense and the women and men fighting in Ukraine, Russia is losing close to a battalion of soldiers every day for the past 2 weeks. Will this confront Russian society soon in a way that will force them to confront the things that they've been desirous to set aside, to not concentrate on, and to go about their lives? Will Russia's waning success come home to roost for Putin politically and domestically? Or do you think Russians will continue to ignore the war?
I think they would like to continue ignoring the wars as long as they can, and Putin will be is very interested in maintaining this situation as long as he can. So it will depend on how successful the Ukrainian advances will be in the close future. And of course, I understand that any wide-scale losses or defeat of Russian troops in Ukraine will have its impact on Putin and his regime, of course, because no propaganda, there has never been a propaganda which can be successful in 100%. Of course, some knowledge will leak into people's minds, and people will see more coffins, and they will hear those who return from the front, some retiring soldiers, deserters, people wounded, and and there will be a different picture. And of course, I think, and my most hope is that it's not the mass protest that Putin is afraid of. It is the protest within his subordinates, his elite, so to speak, which he is afraid of, because it is those. You can imagine that before this war, he promised them that he will give them the whole of Ukraine on a plate, and a part of this, he will bring them like half Europe, because the United States, NATO, European world will be humiliated by how swift and quickly he would destroy Ukraine. And they believed him. And now they see that they are losing a lot. Well, they have lost many assets already in Europe and in the United States. And I think they are not very much delighted thinking that China and India are still open to them, because those people are oriented to live in the West. Their children were educated in the West. They have a lot of property in the West. And so when Russian troops are finally defeated in Ukraine, and Putin has nothing to sell as victory to even to his close supporters, and he will have to find someone guilty for these defeats, and he will never point out at himself, and he will have to find someone more or less famous and known to public, and that must be some people from his inner circle. And I think then they're just instinctively they will have to act just to survive. And then he may think that maybe they no longer need him. So I think his political, and maybe not being political, but maybe his human life is at stake. And he bets everything, all his future on this war. So when he's defeated, he will be, I think, very soon, maybe not instantly, but it may take some weeks or even months, but he will be ended. And with him, his regime, his personal regime, personalist regime, so to speak, will crumble, because there is no legitimacy in this regime, apart from those that is still recognized in Putin. Because Putin is still popular among, I don't know, some people in Russia, some millions, who may be considered as his supporters. But without him personally, they will not support anybody from his inner circle, because they don't even know them. There is only one politician in Russia, it is President Putin. All others are just some gray people with unremarkable faces. That's it.
This can often be a very disconcerting time if there is a transition of power, especially from an authoritarian regime, which you so rightly point out, vest all popularity, propaganda, and identity in the authoritarian head of state. The legitimacy of anybody else in the government doesn't exist in reality and would need to be established. So the question is fantasists have been saying for some time that Putin has cancer, he will die soon, he'll be murdered by his friends, the oligarchs that he can no longer hand trinkets to. But the real question is do other people in the upper echelons of government and those who can seize power after Putin think like him? Or is he a peculiar animal? I know that a lot of people like to say that Navalny is a great alternative, but Navalny's views on Ukraine were very similar to Putin's. Can we really expect someone to have a different view about democracy, the rule of law, international relations, and the West? Or do they all think like Vladimir Putin? Is it groupthink?
Well, first of all, let me be clear about Alexei Navalny, who is now in prison, and he will stay in prison as long as Putin stays in power. It's obviously. So he said, yes, once he said he expressed some views on Ukraine. It was, I think, during the Crimea events. But if we look at his more recent statements, we will see that his position on Ukraine and on Crimea is totally different from Putin. So I think I also am seeing in mass media some campaigns against Navalny. So sometimes some people even say that we can imagine that it is Navalny who attacked Ukraine and who occupied Crimea. Sorry, not Putin. But I think it's completely incorrect to say so. So I have no doubt that Alexei Navalny is pro-democratic politician, and if he's allowed to lead his political campaign, I think he will gather a lot of votes in any fair and free elections. Okay, going back to your question, the chief ideology of Putin regime is very simple. It is that people around Putin keep their seats for lifetime, and they steal money and resources from the Russian economy as long as they can. That's all. There is no communist, capitalist, fascist, no other ideology at all. All they say it's just just label for the public, because you cannot just explain to your electorate that you will keep your seat forever, you will live in chocolate and champagne forever, while they have to survive on very small money, for all their life. You cannot, even Putin cannot sell it to them. So now I think those who are around Putin, they share his views on Ukraine, on the Ukrainian history, on the place of Russia in the world, and so on, because he wants them to share it. Without him, I think they will easily accept any other ideology. There are some, I think, people who are quite sincere, but I think they will be also pushed aside once he's gone. Or maybe they will try to have the power, but even if they are as radical as Putin is now, or even more radical, that will only make it sooner to disrupt everything that would be still intact. And the fall of this kind of government will be even more inevitable. So I think there are a lot of people who see what is going on and who are not delighted, who are not glad to see it, yet they don't have enough, will to say it out loud, but they can, and they will be, I think, quite useful for to start negotiation to end the war. So I think there's some people from the so-called economic bloc of the government, for instance. I don't know, maybe current prime minister, who is considered to be more technical and more expert kind of guy rather than politician, and he may be more sober thinking. Or some other economists and some other people in the government who are much more adequate, So I think it is them who may take the power after Putin, and his the most closest subordinates will go for the time. And this new government, in order to save themselves, they will have to start something. They will have to, first of all, to blame Putin for everything bad that befell Russia. And they will start negotiation, they will stop the war, and then it will lead to further crumbling even of this government. And then I think that we will have also prospects for civil conflicts in Russia. And I think all this transition period will be very dangerous. And I think that the Western countries must be ready for that.
I think that's very wise thinking. I appreciate that you say that, Boris. I do share your concern that the destabilization of the government in Russia may well lead to internal conflict. My concern, however, remains that there will be credible actors within the current regime capable of reaching out and forging a new peace, given their embroilment in all the crimes that have gone on. And I was in Irpin, I was in Bucha and Hostomel, in Kharkiv. I've spoken to women and children who were raped, people that were brutalized. I was at the mass grave in Bucha. There will be a reckoning in the international world community based on the rule of law. And it'll be interesting to see who within the regime can remain above it, who is still capable of leading Russia in a new government. I want to switch now to a less general set of questions, to talking more about your area of expertise, which is arms control. We see Russia engaging with Iran with drone technology. They're supporting Iran with their nuclear enrichment program. Russia's relationship with China is something they celebrate, but it's complicated, and China will act in its own best interests. North Korea receives support from Russia and has decided to enshrine in legislation that they will forever be a nuclear weapons state. What are the hot points to your mind in arms control on the horizon? And given the polarization between the Russian Federation and the West, their relationship with China, India, the lines aren't very clear these days. It's not like the old days where there were spheres of influence when everything was black and white. Even people who are opposed to Russia's invasion of Ukraine don't entirely condemn Russia and still contain a good relationship with Russia. What are the big issues and where do you see all of it going?
Yes, it is very, very complicated things, and it is very useful to have in mind that not everybody on the globe considers this war in Ukraine as we consider it in Europe or in the West. For China, India, for Africa, for some Latin American countries, it's something distant, something, some kind of domestic European problems, and why they should pay so much attention to that, because they have a lot of their own problems. So this is also natural. So I think it is up to the Western diplomacy, first of all, to deliver the correct message and to explain that this war, this aggression of Russia has very long consequences, even for those countries who may believe that they are very, very remote and they cannot be directly affected by this. I think the Russian leadership starting to understand that they are losing. Yeah, they're trying to address to other countries like North Korea and Iran, but I don't think that it will be of much help to them anyway. And I think that the main influence to the entire sphere of arms control, non-proliferation, will be if Russia is defeated by Ukraine and will have to admit its defeat, because it would mean that the nuclear state, nuclear power, cannot win a war against a formerly non-nuclear weapon state, even if this is supported by other countries. So it would be very interesting development, which would say that even if you have nuclear weapons, it doesn't guarantee that you cannot lose a war. So you will have, so the significance of nuclear weapons will go down, because some people will understand that if you are losing the war, you will have to use nuclear weapons. But if you use nuclear weapons, it will be well, almost suicidal act. So it will bring you no benefit. And that, I think, that may be a very great impetus to further nuclear, maybe not in disarmament, but to reshaping of the current concepts of non-proliferation, of disarmament in nuclear spheres. And that will be very interesting and very useful, I think. And it may bring us to the next level of nuclear philosophy, so to speak, and maybe in perspective make our world more secure. So I think that will maybe the biggest impact of the war.
One of the things that I've observed is that there is a competing notion that Ukraine gave up what was then the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world in exchange for security guarantees. And Russia signed up to that in the Budapest Memorandum. Then they get invaded by Russia. What message does that send to states like North Korea, Iran, or others who might aspire towards nuclear weaponization, that the only way to protect yourself is to build a nuclear arsenal, even if you never use it? Is there a perversity in continuing to allow Russia to sit on the UN Security Council, knowing that when it comes to nuclear security, they only see it within the context of their self-interest. What message does that send to aspiring nuclear states?
Well, let's not forget that Iran and North Korea developing the nuclear programs not because of Russia the violation of Budapest Memorandum, but because of the first of all U.S. policy toward those countries. Because U.S. has constantly threatened both Iran and North Korea, and we know that. So I think those countries, they consider to have nuclear weapons as the main resource to preserve their own independence, sovereignty, and defensibility. Yes, and so if we speak about the Russian seat in the Security Council, that's also a different thing. I also take a note that some people are now pushing the idea to expel Russia from the Security Council on some pretext that it was not formally endorsed by the General Assembly after the collapse of Soviet Union, blah, blah, blah. So making this as a purely legal question, which is of course not. Because it is a political question, and okay, if you want to expel Russia, then who will get this seat? There will be a lot of contenders. There will be India, there will be Japan, there will be Germany, there will be Brazil, South Africa, and a lot of other countries. And that, I think, the very idea of this will make the United Nations even less active, just, I would say, paralyzed for many years. It's not the reform of the Security Council, which we are discussing now. But I agree with you that after what we see and after what Russia has done, it shouldn't have this authority of the permanent member of the Security Council, because it makes this most important international body totally helpless. And yeah, so.
Are you surprised that Russia has almost weaponized civilian nuclear electricity generation by seizing the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and forcing its workers under duress to continue to operate in an unsafe manner? Is this not the weaponization of civilian nuclear energy? Is that the threat to Europe, or do you think that's an overstatement?
Well, first of all, I don't know why they even are doing that with this power plant, because if something happens there, it will have terrible consequences, not only for Europe, but for European part of Russia as well. So I don't know why we should, mess with all these very, very risky things at this power plant. As for whether it is a weaponization or something, I don't know. I don't know. I don't have the facts telling this or that. I think, and having in mind the way how the Russian state is functioning, I don't think that it is something that they do on purpose, like to weaponize this. It's just they're just trying to use this possible damage and harm for this power plant as a part of their blackmail policy. So they're trying to convince all the world that it is Ukraine which constantly shells this power plant, setting it under the risk of nuclear, contamination and so on. Totally silly, because nobody believes it. So I don't have it. It's another sign of this reckless policy, because when they elaborate some policy and they are implementing it, they don't think about next steps.
So I want to follow up on that because that's a very interesting observation. When I see that from the context of conflict resolution, one has to always worry about the unintended consequences of decisions or conduct. Russia shuts off Nord Stream and it imperils their economy. They invade Ukraine knowing that sanctions will follow. There seems to be a disconnect between the immediacy of satisfying a juvenile desire to achieve a goal and a mature understanding of what that means for the long term. So the question I have is really, is there a future for a democratic Russia, given the decisions being made today that are injurious to Russia and its people, as much as they are to Ukraine and to Europe? They are ruining Russia day by day. Will we see a new authoritarian uprising in Russia, a populist answer for all ills, or will we see the embrace of a democratic future? What are your insights? What are your thoughts and guesses?
It's a very good question. And I would say that I do believe there is a chance of democratic Russia, because since the collapse of Soviet Union, we have 1 or 2 generations who were born and grow in the time of relative freedom, so to speak. They know what the market economy is. They know what basic human rights and freedoms are, and they don't want to give up on them. And we know that most of those people who protest against Putin, they are the young generations. So I think there is social basis for democratic Russia. But of course, this transformation will be very, as I already said, very dangerous and very complicated. And I think a lot of things here will be dependent on how the Western countries will behave. Because I see that in 1991, the West was celebrating its final victory in the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And in this celebration, they forgot that these new countries that were just plunged from Soviet life into modern life, totally unprepared for that those countries could have been supported and helped to go through this very difficult period of transformation. They were not helped and supported, and that made possible for Putin and his lie to come to power on this revanchist sentiments within the Russian side. I remember in the 90s, there were a lot of expectations in very positive attitude towards Europe and the United States. It was like, at last we can be together, at last we can cooperate, we can be friends and blah, blah, blah. But then by the end of the 90s, the situation was changing and people were thinking that we live very, very bad. We live in poverty. There is no prospects even. They didn't see any prospects of their living standards being enhanced somehow. And the West helped with just a few credits from International Monetary Fund and so on. And then Putin came up and he said, we will be building our own sovereign democracy and the West will have no say in our domestic affairs and blah, blah, blah. And people say, okay. So my point is that once Putin and his regime is gone, and the situation may be very difficult, and it is not obligatory that democratic forces will come to power. It is not. I don't think that it's not 100%, maybe not even 50% that Mr. Navalny, if and other political prisoners, they get free, but I don't think that they are popular enough to lead some kind of uprising and storm the Kremlin, in order to establish a new democratic government and start these structural revolutionary reforms which our society has been in need for so many years. And that, I think, and of course, this tumult, this civil conflict will mean for most of people the great deterioration of their daily life. And I think the help and support from the Western countries will be essential. And I'm speaking about a new iteration of the Marshall Plan. Because if you want to isolate Russia for good after the war in Ukraine is ended, then Russia will be most likely turned into the giant North Korea, with nukes, with very radical political government, much more radical than Putin. And it will be a constant source of instability and threats to Europe, to Asia, everywhere. If you want to dismantle Russia, to dissolute it into a few, 10, 15 independent states, so to speak, that will mean a large area of internal conflicts with consequences going far from the former Russian borders. It also will be a very bad development. So I think that the only way to remove Russian threat for good is to help to rebuild Russia on new democratic and federalism principles, and that the economic support of democratic forces in Russia will be essential. And I would like you to deliver this message to your audience, because I think it is a crucial moment.
As galling as it is, I would agree with you. We need to focus on the redevelopment of Russia once Ukraine regains all of its sovereign territory, that we not create another Treaty of Versailles situation in which Russia is driven to the point of radicalization. But at the same time, I would differ that George Herbert Walker Bush was a young man who fought in World War II. He lived through the Cold War. He rose through the political ranks, ran the CIA, became a vice president, and then president. Those of us who study the presidency would say that he went very easy on Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that there were olive branches extended. Unfortunately, Russia devolved into kleptocracy, where the wealthy exploited the resources of Russia, made the poor poorer, and allowed Putin and his colleagues to blame the West, that there was no denazification that happened. And I think for students of history, there will be a concern that assisting Russia, which will have to happen, mature minds know this, even if our passions would militate against it, that there needs to be a change of thinking in Russia, because reforming Russia to become a new threat, whether it was under colonialism, the Soviet Union, or the Russian Federation, isn't something the West has an appetite for, any more than it has an appetite to see, the stands and all the different territories devolve into internal conflict. It'll be complicated. That's a conversation we have to have again.
With all due respect to President Bush, the senior, you mentioned, I think maybe it was a mistake of the West dealing with Russia in the 90s, that they invested too much in personalities like President Yeltsin, relying on his promises to develop democracy and closing eyes on what was happening really. So I'm totally agree with you that if West is to assist Russia in reforming its society, it must be under strict control. It must be about institutions, not personalities. That's I totally agree with you. Yeah.
And I would observe that you're largely right about that issue. Likewise, institutions have to have value. Otherwise, we end up with a Weimar Republic that's weak and subject to manipulation when it devolves. I want to talk to you as a person, as a diplomat. Is there life after a courageous stance for a diplomat? You were valued by the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. You advanced over the years. You were in Geneva, which says much about what Russia thought of you and your capabilities, your insights, and your skills. And yet, after your very public letter of resignation, Dmitry Peskov, Putin's pet in the Kremlin, his spokesman, said, "We in the Kremlin are unfamiliar with this letter. If he was an employee of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, this is probably a question for the MFA." Nobody believes that statement. Everybody knew who you were and everybody read your letter. It was on the front page of every newspaper from here to Siberia. Has Russia been using its influence to impede your future, whether it's in academia, in a think tank, or finding work since your resignation?
Well, frankly speaking, I have no idea, and I would doubt that they are doing something to, to create obstacles for me, because I think from the high opposition of Peskov and his boss, I think I'm small fish, and I don't think that if. Okay, let's imagine that I think the Russian ambassador in Switzerland goes to the Federal Council saying, if Mr. Bondarev wants to have a job in Switzerland, please reject him. I don't think that they will follow his advice anyway. So I don't think that Russian authorities are paying much attention to me, and thanks for that. Regarding your life after diplomacy, I don't know. I'm in the process of finding the answer to that question.
But, let me push back a little bit. While you say you're a small fish, there must be a fear in the Kremlin that other diplomats will follow and resign for reasons of morality or ethics or values. The reason I say this is Wolfgang Ischinger, the former head of the Munich Security Conference, had invited you to speak at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Did you speak there? Why not? Why aren't you more front and center than you are today, leading a relatively quiet existence?
First, I don't recall that I had received any invitations to speak on the Davos forum, so to speak. So I don't know, maybe it's just mass media was about that. Second, that after my resignation, the Swiss authorities provided some security for me, and I was advised to keep a low profile for some time without any public events and so on. So now I'm speaking to mass media mostly through video calls, and if I'm invited to speak somewhere at some prominent meeting, that I would be very much honored, and I would try to do that. So for now, I'm trying to accommodate to the reality I'm in, and yes. So I'm not trying to write some articles, to have some interviews. So I'm trying to deliver my message.
I think you have a lot to offer. A lot of us in the defense and security community would hope that you have a book in you. I think you have a lot to say from your insights as a diplomat and as a patriot, because the view for many inside of Russia and outside is that what you did was for Russia. It was a patriotic act and not a traitorous act. So let me ask you, do you still hold a Russian passport? Are you a stateless person? What were the consequences of resigning?
The consequences of resigning were first that I lost my job, and my diplomatic passport was notified, well, subsequently. So no, I am a Russian citizen, and under the current constitution, there is no authority to rid me of my citizenship. So I'm determined to remain a Russian citizen. So I still believe that my future will be in Russia, and I want to come back to Russia and to help this transformation we discussed today. So now I have Swiss government permitted me to stay in Switzerland for some time, so I'm very grateful to them for that.
Are you able to travel?
Well, it's a sensitive matter, because it is connected with some security measures that the Swiss authority are concerned about my security for some reasons, and well, it's.
You say for some reasons. Those who dissent with the Kremlin, and particularly Mr. Putin, have an odd habit of ending up dead through murder, poison, shootings within the shadows of the Kremlin. They end up in prison camps like Mr. Navalny. Do you have concerns for your security?
I cannot say that, because there are a lot of dissidents and immigrants who openly protest against Putin, and they still quite alive, and for instance, I don't know, a lot of people who fled Russia now recently or 10 years ago, and they still are okay. So I think these punishment measures are very selective, and I really don't consider myself to be that kind of threat to Kremlin that would deserve some kind of that, But I don't know. Of course, I cannot say for those people, because we know they are losing their minds every day.
I would ask you to listen to your Swiss friends who are concerned for your security. Boris, before we leave, do you have any last thoughts for us? Any things that we didn't cover that you'd like to say?
I'd like to say to your audience that despite this fratricidal war of Russia against Ukraine and against the Western world in general, President Putin and his regime does not embody Russia and Russian society and Russian people. It is a usurping gang which tries to represent Russia and make Russia can be considered as guilty. But Russian people are different, and we must understand that not all Russians are in support of war, and there are millions of people who protest the war, and those people are the future of Russia. And I hope that when this war is ended and Ukraine wins the war and Ukraine defends its sovereignty, its territorial integrity and independence, that will make Russia change for the better. I hope so.
As I talk to foreign ministers and diplomats across Europe, especially those, the former Warsaw Pact, Soviet republics, they fear that if Russia prevails in Ukraine at any level, that Putin will take it as an invitation to put them at risk. Do you think that's hyperbole, or do you think it's a realistic concern?
I think he has nothing to sell to his supporters in Russia other than military successes. So he is doomed to wage war in Ukraine or somewhere else. It may not be Eastern Europe, but it may be Kazakhstan or Caucasus or Moldova, for instance, or Baltic states. So I think that the concerns are grounded. I don't say that it is very much probable, but I cannot say that we should exclude this possibility at all. No.
And do you see Ukraine winning this conflict?
I do because they have no other choice, you know.
I remember being in Maidan Square in maybe March or April. I was doing a report for Turkish television, and I was asked whether Ukraine could hang on. These were dark days in Mariupol, and I observed that if Russia quits fighting, the war is over. But if Ukraine quits fighting, Ukraine is over.
Yes.
I don't know that Ukraine has an option but to fight on. And I think for that very reason, they will win. And it's a day that couldn't come soon enough. It's destabilizing the world and all of Europe. And especially in Africa, where people are hungry because of grain shortages, restoring Ukraine to its sovereignty and territorial integrity is, I think, central to world peace at this time.
Yes, and there is a prerequisite for Ukrainian victory is the massive military support from the West. Without it, Ukraine, I don't think, can fight for long. So it's up to the West to secure the Ukrainian victory.
Those are wise insights. I found much of what you said fascinating today and very insightful. I'm sure we'll talk again. And I'm certain that whatever academy or think tank or wherever you land, you will have nothing but success. You have a lot to offer. And I again congratulate you on your courage for standing up for Russia, not Putin's Russia, but for Russia, and speaking out against the evils of that regime. This is Miceal O'Hurley. You've been watching In Conversation this week. We've had a very fascinating guest. Boris Bondarev, the former Russian Federation diplomat with a specialty in arms control and non-proliferation, who was in Geneva, who resigned quite publicly, and today has a lot to say about what it's going to take to restore Russia to a democracy and bring about world peace. Boris, we wish you well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.